So, you want to build a PC? Good news! The following guide will walk you through every step in the process. Say for selecting the individual components that make up the build. For suggestions on components for a range of budget check out the latest version of the Tech Report System Guide at techreport.com. The enthusiast-worthy system we're putting together today uses parts pulled from our stash of test hardware in addition to a stack of components provided graciously by ASUS and Corsair. Setting the stage. Before beginning or build, clear a large, clean work area, preferably avoid of 70s era carpet and anything else that might induce or static electrical charge. Gather a few Q-tips, some rubbing alcohol, a fistful of zip ties, and a Phillips head screwdriver. The few screws we'll encounter are relatively small, so it helps to have a screwdriver with a magnetic tape ground yourself before doing anything else. You can discharge any static by touching a large metal object like a filing cabinet, the frame of a desk, or even a metal PC case. Ground yourself frequently. If you're in a carpeted room or wearing a static-prone fabric like polyester, just moving around may be enough to generate a static charge. Make sure the parts match. PC components are largely interchangeable, but you can combine just anything. CPUs, colors, and motherboards are designed around specific sockets, and the motherboard's form factor needs to match the case. AMD sockets are riddled with tiny holes to accept pins on the bottom of the CPU. Intel's LJ sockets work in reverse with the pins on the motherboard and contact pads on CPU. Intel and AMD both have different versions of these sockets, so make sure your CPU and motherboard match. Motherboards comes in three main sizes or form factors: ATX, Micro ATX, and Mini ATX. ATX is the largest, followed by Micro ATX and Mini ATX. We've illustrated this with the ASUS P8Z77V and ATX board, the P8Z77-M Pro, a Micro ATX model, and the P8Z77 Deluxe, which is Mini ATX. The bigger the board, the more room there is for memory and expansion slots. ATX cases can handle all three form factors. Micro ATX cases support Micro ATX and Mini ATX boards, but it's not possible to install a board into a case meant for a smaller form factor. Installing the CPU. Some components are easier to install. Motherboard outside the case. Start by putting the board on a flat insulated surface. First, we'll install the CPU, a process that's different depending on whether you're using an AMD or Intel socket. Let's start with an AMD A3850, which plugs into socket FM1. Ready the FM1 socket by nudging the metal lever away from the side and then swinging it all the way back. Pick up the CPU by carefully pinching it between your thumb and your forefinger. The pins are fragile, so don't bend in one corner of the CPU with have a small triangular marker line. Hit up the corresponding mark on the socket and lower the CPU slowly into place. When the CPU is seated, will be no gap between the rim of the package and the surface of the socket. Press down on the CPU gently with your finger, then swing the lever back into its original position. Tuck under the plastic tab on the side of the socket. the Intel LGA 1155 socket for our build Core i7 3770K processor is similar to operate, but there are a couple of extra steps. First, you'll need to remove the protective plastic cover from the face of the socket. This piece shields the underlying pins, so be careful. Next, unhook the metal lever by pushing it away from the socket, then swing back the lever. The LGA 1155 arm swings back much farther than its counterpart on the FM1 socket until CPUs are aligned with LGA sockets using identifications on the processor package. Two semicircular notches appear on opposing edges of the processor, matching a corresponding pair of knobs on the inner walls of the socket. Pick up the CPU by carefully pinching in your thumb and forefinger. Be sure to pinch the edges without the notches match the notches to the socket before slowly lowering CPU in place. When the CPU is resting on the socket, wiggle the chip gently away the hand. After the CPU is seated, properly flip the metal frame down into the processor, then swing the lever back to its original position. Make sure the feet at the end of the frame straddle the anchor screw next to the socket. A little bit of force will be required to hook the lever under the metal tab that locks the socket shut. Priming the processor. Now that the CPU is installed, it needs to be prepped for the cooler start by cleaning the heat spreader, the metal cap covering the top of the processor. Give the heat spreader a quick scrub using a Q-tip. Dip in rubbing alcohol, brush the metal cap gently to remove any particulate or oily residue that might have been deposited on the surface. You can also use a higher concentration alcohol or a paper towel. Just be sure you don't leave behind any fibers or other debris in the CPU. The stock coolers bundled with retail box CPUs typically have a thermal interface material or temperature applied to the base of the heatsink. If you don't have a separate tube of thermal paste, leave the factory coating as is. You can skip straight to installing the cooler. Folks who wants to replace the stock pin with another compound will first need to get rid of the original. Why bother? Because stock pins are usually thicker than is optimal for heat and transfer. Only a thin layer of compound is required to fill surface imperfections in the base of heatsink and the top of the heat spreader. Pins usually need to be scraped off. Avoid using metal hooks when can leave scratches in the base of the heatsink. We recommend something with a hard plastic edge like a credit card. Once the tip has been scraped off, scrub the surface in rubbing alcohol. If any residue remains, you may need to resort to a more noxious solvent like nail polish remover. If your cooler is hemp-free, it's still worth taking a moment to clean the base of the heatsink. Another alcohol-soaked Q-tip should do the trick. There are different schools of thought on how to best apply the thermal compound cooler. Makes typically recommend squeezing a pea-sized dollop of the group into the center of the CPU's heat spreader, then plopping the heatsink down right on top of that lump, tightening the cooler's retention mechanism will flatten the blob of compound, spreading it evenly between the CPU and heatsink. If you can spread the compound by hand using a credit card, razor blade, something like plastic tool. We're using some compounds can leave the silver stain on skin and clothing, so be careful. Concentrate on spreading the compound evenly over the CPU. Unless you're a seasoned builder, we recommend letting the heatsink do all the spreading. In our experience, in our experience, the lazy export results substantially higher the CPU. CPU coolers come in all shapes and sizes. We're going to show you a few different variations starting with a stock AMD design. AMD sockets have integrated heatsink brackets that are screwed into the motherboard. Note the outward facing tabs in the middle of each one. Stock AMD coolers have a metal beam that anchors the heatsink to these tabs. One end of the beam will have a lever which should be open. Place the cooler and the CPU lining up the ends of the beam with the plastic tabs. Hook the beam up to the tab, starting with the side opposite the lever. Then, flip the lever down to lock the cooler into the socket. Once the cooler is secured, plug the fan into the corresponding header on the motherboard. Use the 3 or 4 pin header marked CPU near the socket. The motherboard manual will indicate its precise location. Don't worry if the number of pins on the motherboard doesn't match the fan plug DC fans. DC fans work just fine in PWM headers to the PWM fans work in DC headers. Just be sure to line up a plastic tab on the header with the ridges on the fan connector. Until stock coolers are quite different from AMD's. Instead of a mounting bracket, motherboards have 4 holes for the heatsink's anchoring post. Before the heatsink is mounted, its push pins need to be primed. Rotate the cap on the top of each post counterclockwise, tag up to ensure the attached black pin is recessed in the post. Then rotate the caps clockwise. The cap should turn only 90 degrees. Lower the cooler onto the socket. The post lined up with the holes in the motherboard. When the cooler is resting comfortably, push the post down once at a time. Secure the pins on opposite corners of the socket. First, much like you would when bolting a wheel to a car, the pins should make an audible click when they lock into place. To make sure the pins are secure, flip the motherboard. You should see a protruding black tip pushing apart the translucent pieces that anchor the push pin after mounting the CPU cooler. Plug in the fan. Stock Intel coolers typically use 4-pin PWM headers. If you need to remove the Intel cooler, rotate the post counterclockwise, pull up on each one to release the pins, and then lift the cooler of the socket. The posts are slotted to accept a flat-third screwdriver if you can't reach them with your fingers. If the retention mechanism is loose but the cooler still feels bonded to the CPU, rotate the heatsink back and forth slightly. Some thermal compounds have a tendency to stick, but the twisting motion usually breaks the grip. You don't want to yank off the cooler with the CPU stuck to the bottom. Compared to the aftermarket equivalents, the stock coolers sold with AMD and processors are relatively small. The fan sits on top of the heatsink, blowing air down into fins perpendicular to the motherboard. Aftermarket solutions are typically made up of dual radiator that rises up from the socket with 1 or 2 fans pushing air parallel to the surface of the motherboard. Combining more surface area with greater airflow tends to produce lower temperatures and less noise. Aftermarket cooler sometimes use similar mounting mechanisms to their stock counterparts, but mainly rely on custom backplate hardware. Follow the instructions associated with a cooler. This Corsair Air Series 70 is pretty typical to breed. The backplate sits under the motherboard and the cooler is attached to it using nuts on each corner. Remember to tighten opposite corners first. The fans are attached separately, which is often the case for aftermarket coolers since the fan is blown parallel to the board. Make sure the airflow is pointing towards the chase's exhaust vent, usually found in the rear or top panels of the case. Fans typically indicate the direction of the airflow with arrows located on the edge of the frame. One arrow indicates the path and airflow, while the other shows the rotational direction of the fans. If there are no markers to use as guide, most fans blow in the direction of the frame holding the rotor, and its shaded motor in the text side is typically completely open or covered by a grill to prevent your fingers from getting munched by the blade. Setting the memory. Color orientation is also important for memory compatibility. The A7II doesn't branch out from the socket enough to overlap our motherboard's DIMM slots, but one of its removed spreaders and agriculture denominator memory. Most desktop systems are dual channel memory. For optimal performance, once DIMM per channel is required, motherboards typically come with 4 slots or 2 per channel. If you're installing only 2 DIMMs, check the motherboard manual for guidance on which slots to use. 2 DIMM configs typically drop into slots labeled A1 and B1. The letters signify the channel, while the numbers reveal the order in which the slots should be populated before installing the memory. Make sure the plastic retention tabs at the ends of the DIMM slots are open. Some motherboards like our Asus P8Z77B have retention tabs on only one side of the memory slot's DIMMs. Our key to fit only one way, making installation simple. Line up the notch at the bottom edge of the memory nodule with a separator near the middle of the slot, then slide the module into place. Apply even downward pressure to both sides of the top edge of the module to see it fully in lat sitting. The memory should cause the retention tabs to swing up if they don't flip the tabs with your finger so they hook into the notches in the DIMMs. Preparing the enclosure. Every case is different, but there are 2 predominant layouts in the world of PC towers: traditional designs that put the power supply above the motherboard and upside down once they do the opposite. Our Corsair or Obsidian Series 650D is an example of the latter. That's a bunch of little features that would help during our build, plus some actual peripherals to plug in along the way. First, remove the side panels and set them aside. This case has a tool-free latching mechanism, but some enclosures require a screwdriver for this step. The left panel exposes the main compartment, while the right panel will provide access to the back side of the motherboard tray, which is where we'll be hiding cabling. Motherboards are mounted onto tray using a series of raised posts that line up with holes in the circuit board. The 650D has these posts pre-installed. If your case doesn't screw in the post tightly by hand, they should be included in a bag with all the other screws. Make sure the posts match the hole pattern of the motherboard, otherwise they can short, expose solder points and damage the system. We recommend using the whole 9 posts with an ATX motherboard. After securing the post, install the I/O shield that came with your motherboard. Some cases come with their own I/O shields, but odds are they won't match the ported layout of your board. Pop out the existing shield by pushing it into the case from the outside. Install the new one by pressing it into the rectangular cutout. Next to the motherboard tray, make sure the shield is the right way around half dozen or 6 circular holes for the audio jack. Jacks should be in the left side towards the expansion slot. Covers some of the shield internal tabs may block the part holes a little bit, bend up and either get in the way, making sense of all the screws. Although never cases use tool-free mechanism for most parts, PCs have traditionally relied on a series of different screws to secure the various components. Well, start with a couple M3 screws with different caps. Note the tight thread spacing. The screws with larger heads are typically reserved from other boards and optical drives, while those with smaller heads are used with SSDs. Next to the M3 screws are a pair of 632 screws meant for hard drives PSUs. Expansion cards and side panels, the thread spacing is much larger. Here use the small headed screws for hard drives and the larger heads for everything else. A lot of cases secure side panels and expansion cards with 632 screws that have huge thumb-friendly heads. Next to that, we have the screw used to attach case fans. Last but not the least is motherboard post, hard drive and SSD installation. Before putting the motherboard inside the case, it's worth populating the drive base. We'll start with a 3.5-inch hard drive, which will typically be affixed to the rails or drive sled that slides easily into the case. Into the 650D, remove one of the sleds, flex the walls away from each other, and then place the drive between them and the metal knobs in the walls. Will line up with the screws holes in the sides of the drive. If your case doesn't have tool-free sleds, use the screws holes to affix the drive to the cage. If rubber grommets are included with the case, use them like as spacers between the drive and the cage. Rubber grommets help dampen vibration, noise, and the 650D sleds have them pre-installed intestinal right panels. Try to point the driver's connectors to the right side, that where we're going to hide the cabling. If you can get a right side of the cage, orient the drive so the connectors are accessible. SSDs use a smaller 2.5-inch form factor meant for notebook drives. Most newer cases have mounting holes for the sides usually on the same sled used for hard drives. The 650D let us screw the SSD in the bottom of the drive sled. Don't worry about the grommets here. SSDs have no moving parts, so they don't generate vibration or noise. If your case doesn't have dedicated 2.5-inch mounting hardware, most SSDs come with 3.5-inch bay adapters. Attach the adapter to SSD, then putting the whole thing into the 3.5-inch in placement. Orient the SSD connectors to match the hard drive. The 650DS drive cage sits next to a massive fan, so we put the SSD and the hard drive near the middle of the path of airflow. If you don't have a fan near the cage, put the drives lower, which is usually where temperatures are cooler. Leave at least 1 day's worth of space between them. Adding an optical drive. Optical drive haven't gone the way of floppies just yet. Blu-ray and DVD drives slip into external 5.25-inch bites, which typically have covers that need to be removed. After 650D case requires that the front bezel be removed before popping up. The cover bezels are usually held by plastic tabs in their inside vertical edges. To press their tabs and pop off the bezel. With the bezel removed, We can pop out the cover associated with the bay we want to use. Choose the bay that's easiest to reach, depending on whether your case will be sitting on top of your desk or beneath it. Line up the bezels of plastic stubs before snapping it back into place. Slide in the optical drive until it's flush with the bezel, then flip the toll-free latching mechanism to lock them in place. If you don't have a toll-free, secure the drive with screws. Optical drives have 4 screw holes per side, so at least one at the front and back of each side of the drive. Swapping a fan. Most enclosures have come with at least a couple of their own cooling fans already installed. These work just fine, but you can swap in quieter or more powerful units. To show you the process, we're going to ditch the 120mm rear exhaust fan for a Corsair Air series of 120. Most cases suck in air from the front of exhaust it out the rear and top, so we're going to orient the fan to blow outside and the case. Remember that the fan direction is indicated on the side of the frame. Remove the existing fans for screws and use them to affix the new one. If the holes in the fan don't line up with the ones in the mounting point, the fan probably isn't the right size. Inserting the motherboard. With the case prime, it's time to install the motherboard. Lay the case on its side so the motherboard can be lowered onto the tray. Depending on how much room there is to work inside your case, and the motherboard may need to be inserted at angle with the port side first. Line up the ports with the holes in the IO shield and let the board rest on the post. The board may need to be nudged towards the rear of the case to line up the screw holes. Magnetic tip screwdriver really helps when guiding the tiny screws onto the post, as we did with the CPU cooler. Tighten the screws on the opposing corners. First, that should keep the board centered over the posts. Circuit boards are more fragile than the case's metal panels. Until they're snug, but don't give them an extra twist after that. Next, start wiring the motherboard for the cleanest layout. Run cables along the right side of the case behind the drive cage and the motherboard tray. Newer chases should have enough routing holes to keep the cables hidden until they need to poke out the make connections to the motherboard. Leave the excess wiring hanging loose on the right side of the chassis for now. That side will be tidied up when everything is connected well. Tackle the front panel connectors first. Find a bundle of thin wires with ends labeled power, SW reset, SW power, LED, and HDD. Leave this to control the power and reset switches plus the LEDs at the front of the case. Motherboards still haven't agreed on standard layout for the front panel connectors. You'll have to consult the manual to see where the wires go. They should all plug into a single block of pins on the motherboard. Some boards, like our Asus Fate CZZ, they come with a separate pin block that allows this wiring to be done outside the case. Simply attach the connectors to the auxiliary block, then plug that into the motherboard. Front panel USB to firewire and audio ports. Use 10-pin connectors that are keyed differently to prevent insertion into the wrong header. Locate the associated headers. We're going to skip or return the front panel view after we install our sound card. There are two ways to connect the front panel USB 3 ports found in most newer cases. The first method relies on a 20-pin block that plugs directly into the motherboard header. The 650D lacks the matching connector, but it has leads that plug into USB ports in the rear cluster. Well, thread these cables at the back of the case and into the rear ports. Blue internals differentiate USB 3 ports from slower USB 2 ports. Next, connect system fans. Most case fans use DC plugs, similar to those employed by CPU coolers, while the boards have dedicated headers for system fans, typically labeled CHA or SYS. The manual will map out the locations of these headers. Some fans use much larger 4-pin Molex connectors. These fans need to be plugged into the power supply, which we'll install in a moment. Graphics time. Installing a graphics card is easy. We're going to use Asus HD 7870 Direct CU2 TAP, which is a mid-range of offering with a dual slot color. Although the card plugs into only one PCI Express expansion slot, the color takes up the slots. We'll need to remove two of the expansion slot covers at the back of the case to make room for the graphic card. To determine which ones locate the primary PCI Express X16 slot, which is usually one of the top slots on the motherboard. Our board's top slot is a PCI Express X1, which is much shorter than X16 slot below it. Those two is another X1 slot followed by an old school PCI slot. Note how the PCL and PCI slots have notches in different positions to prevent cards from being inserted incorrectly. Remove the expansion slot cover next to the X16 slot. Also remove one below it if you have a dual slot cards. Lower the card into the appropriate slot and make sure the display outputs are facing the back of the case. Apply even pressure along the top edge to sit the card. Fully secure the card to the chassis with the screws from the expansion slot covers. If you need to remove the graphics card, be sure to release the retention tab located at the end of the slot. Other boards use different mechanisms, and you might need to use a poking tool to reach the tab in a fully loaded system. You can run two graphics cards to improve performance. The second card is installed in the secondary PCI Express X16 slot, ideally with some breathing room between it and the first card. Don't block the airflow to the cooler's fans. If you can avoid it, dual card setups need to be linked using the golden finger connectors along the top edge of the cards. Your motherboard should come with a short ribbon cable or circuit board meant for this purpose. This will be labeled SLI for GeForce cards and Crossfire for Radiance. Another expansion card. Expansion cards are good for more than just graphics. We can also add sound cards, TV tuners, overpass SSDs, and other gadgets. We recommend sound cards to anyone with halfway decent speakers or headphones. So we're going to install a Asus Zone RDG sound card. This card has an old school PCI interface, and the installation process is similar to what we went through with the graphics card. Remove the appropriate expansion slot cover from the back of the case. Orient the card with the ports facing the rear. Then apply even pressure along the top edge to sit the card in the slot. Looks good, right? Wrong. The card blocks one of the graphics card's fans. We should really move it to a lower slot instead of doing that. We're going to swap in the Zone R DGX PCI Express X Mon version of the DGR motherboard's only accessible X1 slot is between the graphics card and the processor, an area we don't want to crowd any further. We use the lowest PCI Express X16 slot on the motherboard, which leaves plenty of room for future upgrades. PCI Express X1 cards can fit into any PCI slot with a higher number. The X1 interface isn't long enough to activate the retention tab at the end of the slot, but screwing the backplate into the chassis will hold the card steady. Most sound cards have 10-pin headers for front panel, headphone, and microphone jacks like the front panel USB and the firewire connectors. The audio connector is gauged to fit only one way of your using the motherboard's integrated audio instead of discrete sound card. You can find a similar block of pins in the motherboard. Usually this will be labeled FP audio, more power. Our system is nearly complete, but we still need to add a power supply. Traditional PCs have all their cabling attached, while modular ones allow users to connect only the power leads required by their systems. Here we have Corsair's GS600 at traditional design and the modular ATX X50. All those tentacles branching off the GS600 can complicate installation and wiring. You will be left with a bundle of extra leads that needs to be tucked away somewhere inside the case in a modern PSU. These extra leads can be left in the box where they won't get in the way we prefer modular PSUs, so we're going to use the AX850. Most PSU into the unit and expel 8 through bends at the rear. This arrangement works well for traditional cases that now the PSU above the motherboard because the power supply ends up exhausting hot air from around the CPU. In an upside down chassis like ours, this orientation sucks air through bends in the case floor. That's okay in the 650D, which has a removable filter to prevent dust from getting hovered into the PSU. If you have an upside down case with an unfiltered intake and will be setting the system on the floor, you probably want to flip the unit so fan faces up. The orientation of the PSU can only be changed if the enclosure has the appropriate mounting holes for the flip config. A lot of them do, including the 650D PSUs attached via 4 mounting holes in the rear panel. The screw holes in the PSU have an asymmetrical pattern, which is why some cases work with only one orientation. Line up the holes and attach the PSU using the 632 screws included with the case. Setup doesn't resemble the one we've illustrated. The 650D has a secondary bracket that screws into the floor of the case. We'll make sure the extra bracket is snug against the PSU before screwing it in upside down cases. Around the PSU, making it is easier to modular power leads after the installation. If your chassis isn't as roomy, connect the cables to the PSU before putting it into the case. Most systems will need 24-pin primary connectors and 4-pin auxiliary 12-volt connectors. For the motherboard, graphics cards require 1 or 2 6 to 8 pins PCI Express leads You'll also need as many SATA connectors as you have hard drives, SSDs, and optical drives. We don't need any 4-pin Molex or floppy connectors for our build, but you might require them for yours. Connecting cables. All the components are now installed, but we still need to make a bunch of connections before we fire up the system. This is where you really want to pay close attention to cleanly routing the cables through the portal surrounding the motherboard tray. If your case doesn't have room for cabling behind the tray, try to run wires along the internal scaffolding. Most chassis have enough internal preparations and anchoring points to secure cables with zip ties. Don't start strapping the cables in place until they're all connected. Attach all the drives using the serial ATA drive cables to include with the motherboard, and our system will need cables for the hard drives, the SSD, and the optical drive. The SATA docking station integrated into the top of the case has its own cable attached already. SATA cables are keyed to connect and only one orientation. Use the I-shaped socket as a guide for the tip of the cable. If one of the tips is at a right angle, connect that end to the drive rather than to the motherboard. Connect the devices one at a time. Where you'll want to make sure and any SSDs are connected to the motherboard 6 GB per second. SATA hard drives are worth plugging into these ports, but optical drives are too slow for it to matter. The motherboard manual should identify the speed of each onboard port, all of which tell you which ports are connected to the AMD or Intel platform hubs rather than auxiliary SATA controllers. These are usually the ports with the lowest numbers. Use the AMD or Intel ports first, since they tend to be faster, or 650D enclosure leaves enough room around the edge of the motherboard to plug in SATA cables without too much contortion. If you're working in a tighter enclosure that causes the SATA ports, removing the graphics card can help make those ports more accessible. Now we need to make sure everything can draw power from the PSU with modular power supplies. Connect cables, first the PSU and then to the appropriate components one at a time. The power supply socket should be keyed to accept only the right leads. Start with a motherboard's primary power connector. Line up the clip on the plug with the tab on the outside of the motherboard socket. If connector doesn't slide into the socket smoothly, try flipping it around. The next, attach the auxiliary 12-volt connector, which will use 4 or 8 pins depending on the board. PSU cables often have the highest number of pins that might be required by a given socket, but the end plugs can be split to accommodate lower pins count. Some things that the 12-volt cable is too short to be threaded behind the motherboard tray. Cable extensions are available, or you could string the cable across the top of the motherboard. Most graphic cards requires external power in the form of our 2 PCIe connectors. Ours needs 2 6-pin connectors. If your PCU doesn't have enough PCI, your graphics card, or if the plugs simply don't have enough pins, check the graphics card box for an adapter. Finally, attach the SATA power cables to the SSD, the hard drive, and the optical drive. We're going to connect the 650D docking station to the power supply. With everything connected, it's time to tie up loose ends. Literally use zip ties to neatly arrange the cabling. It's best to bundle adjacent cables rather than dealing with them individually. Keep a low profile behind the motherboard tray. Otherwise, the right side panel might bulge out when it replaces. Also avoid blocking the cutout that provides access to the underside of the CPU socket. The right side of the chassis can look a little messy. As long as the main compartment is clean, only the left side will be visible through the 650DS windowed panel. If you have a troubled PSU that lacks modular cable, bundles up all the unused leads and stuff them somewhere that won't block the airflow. One more thing, liquid cooling. Before we move on to the final touches, we're going to perform a quick upgrade. We wouldn't have recommended water cooling to experienced builders a few years ago, but never closed loop coolers are sealed at the factory, reducing the chance of leaks. They're also very easy to install. Closed loop coolers like this Corsair Hydro Series H80 tend to follow a consistent theme. A block sits on the CPU and is linked to the radiator via a couple of flexible coolant tubes that the radiator usually attaches to a case's 120mm fan mount, which our 650D conveniently has right next to the CPU socket. Most water coolers are bolted to the CPU using custom mounting brackets and block plates. If your case's motherboard tray doesn't have a cutout under the socket, you'll need to remove the board since each cooler's mounting mechanism is slightly different. Consult the manual before installing. Remove both the existing heatsink and the rear fan before installing the water cooler. If this upgrade is being performed on a system you've been using, make sure to unplug the power cord. The head is supposed to be attached first to the case's rear panel and then to the socket. Corsair recommends orienting to the dual fans to suck air into the case and over the radiator, and will oblige since 650D has a massive exhaust fan up top. We don't necessarily need more air blowing out of the case. Although the H80 comes with a couple of its own fans with snap in some Air Series SP120 spinners from Corsair. They look better on video. Once the radiator and fans are connected, install the CPU block. Be sure to clean up any old thermal compound of the CPU before applying a new coat for the water cooler. When the block is secure, connect the cooler's fan plug. The H80's fans attach directly to the block, which has its own LEDs that plug into the motherboard, CPU fan header, and a 4-pin Molex connector for the PSU. Plugging the peripherals. With all the internal components installed, it's time to attach the side panels and connect to the internal peripherals. Move the case to its desired location before hooking up the keyboard, mouse, monitor, and audio. Your keyboard and mouse have USB connectors. Use the ports in the rear cluster and avoid the ones with blue internal tabs. If your keyboards and mice don't need USB 3, next will attach a networking cable to the motherboard's Gigabit Ethernet port, which looks like an oversized phone jack. You remembered, though it was right, the other end of the cable should run directly to your router, modem, or internet cable. Gateway wired networks offer much higher transfer rates than wireless ones, but Wi-Fi is still fast enough for the most connections. The D77B has built-in Wi-Fi, so we'll attach the included antenna. Connect the monitor to the graphics card rather than to the motherboard, which has its own collection of video outs. If your monitor has only an analog VGA input recognizable from the computers dating back to the 80s, You might be able to find an adapter to the graphics card box. Ours use Probe Art P246Q monitor has 3 digital inputs: DisplayPort, HDMI, and DVI. HDMI and DisplayPort are capable of carrying audio signals alongside video, which can sometimes cause Windows to mistakenly set the monitor is the primary audio output. Since the most folks will probably use separate speakers or headphones, we recommend DVI. If you're running a sound card, be sure to use its audio ports instead of the ones in the motherboards. Rear cluster, we're going to plug in Asus built-in AC headset into the front panel ports, which already connected to the zone or sound. Our sound card is speaker should be plugged into the sound card's rear ports glass connection to make its power from the wall socket. The necessary cable should be included with the PSU. Remember to flip the master power switch at the back of the PSU before attempting to turn on the PC or your system. Firmware tweaks, otherwise known as the BIOS or UEFI motherboard firmware, controls numerous system variables. Getting into the interface typically requires hitting a specific key often, delete or F2 during the first few seconds after powering on the system. The splash screen that pops on the boot will indicate which key needs to be pressed. The new generation of the firmware implementations have rich graphical interfaces, complete with mouse support, which each motherboard maker has a different interface style, and we can walk you through them all. The settings we'll be tweaking are fairly consistent from one board to next. So first, we're going to update the motherboard's firmware. Most firmware has an integrated flashing utility. You can download the latest release for your specific model from the manufacturer's website. Put the firmware file on a USB thumb drive connected to the system and boot into the firmware interface. From there, you should be able to launch the flashing utility and select the firmware file on the thumb drive. Make sure the system doesn't lose power during the flashing process, otherwise your motherboard might get hoosed. With the firmware up to date, we can move on to tweaking a few settings. The firmware should have a default profile. You can revert back to in order to erase any changes in ISO space Z77. Motherboard must of the settings confined to the advanced section of the interface. Well, start by checking the CPU's power management features, which keep the chip drawing too much juice at idle. If you have an AMD base right, make sure cool and quiet is enabled on Intel systems. Turn on speed step. Also make sure turbo is enabled for both AMD and Intel processors. This will raise the CPU clock speed when the thermals from it. As recent Intel motherboard, Asus recent motherboard have a multi-core enhancement that overclocks the CPU. By recommend disabling this feature, you can overclock manually if you want the motherboard do a pretty good job of setting right memory speed. Timings based on the modules installed. Some modules like our Corsair Dominators have their speed and timings programmed into special XMP profiles that can be accessed via the firmware unless you know what case latency means. Stick with the auto or XMP profiles. Next, navigate to the storage section of the firmware. Make sure the serial ATH controller is set to HDI mode, which enables command queuing. Also enable hot plugging for any SATA ports you might want to swap drives. where ports associated with the keys drive lock, take a moment to set the boot order if the operating system will be installed from a DVD set. Set the system's optical drive as the primary boot device. If you're installing the operating system from a thumb drive, set that as the primary boot device to ensure the thumb drive is available as a boot option connected before powering on the system. Now, check the secondary boot device. The system has selected the hard drive by default, but we're going to change that to the USSD most firmware menu for changing the hard drive boot priority. Fan controllers are one area where there are a lot of variety and motherboard firmware. Most boards should offer some kind of smart setting. For the CPU, our page Z77V has a couple of preset profiles in addition to the ability to tweak temperature ranges and fan speeds manually. Some motherboard firmware features a fan type setting design to differentiate between DC and PWM fans. If the fans connected to the motherboard have 4-pin plugs, use the PWM setting. DC fans have 3 pins. Since we installed a sound card in our system, we'll turn off the motherboard's integrated audio by disabling HD audio in the peripheral section. There's no need for 2 audio devices to be active at the same time. Most motherboard firmware supports multiple configuration profiles. Before moving on, save the firmware settings to an available profile slot. This will allow you to revert back to our baseline settings quickly if you make additional changes or if you want to disable and overclocking. Installing the OS and drivers. We recommend Windows for a desktop PC. We're going to use Windows 8 since it's Microsoft's latest OS and the one most likely to be installed on new builds. Then the setup is starting. Then click the accept license terms. Make sure to install the OS to the SSD if you have one. Windows should reside on the fastest run in the system. The selection menu doesn't list the drives by name, but it's easy to spot our Neutron SSD smaller capacity. Then still processing. Once the installation drive has been selected, Windows will do its thing. Rebooting is necessary. Then here you go. It is restarting. So as you can see, the model's name. Then after prompting to select a computer name and color scheme Windows, it offers express and custom install options. We recommend a custom install, which lets you enable various OS features depending on your preferences. Then you have to sign into your PC. Then remember, you have to remember it. So don't lost it. Just make sure to take a note of those important details. When you reach the Windows modem UI start screen, it's time to start updating drivers. First, Install the latest platform drivers, also known as the chipset drivers for the motherboard. These are best downloaded directly from the AMD or Intel. For the motherboard's integrated networking plus any auxiliary peripherals like USB or SATA controllers can be downloaded from the motherboard maker's website if you're without an internet connection entirely, or if you need to install the board's networking driver to get online. There should be a driver disk in the motherboard box. These drivers may not be the latest versions, but they should work. The graphics card will come with its own driver disk. Ignore it and grab the latest drivers from AMD or NVIDIA, depending on whether you have a Radeon or GeForce. New graphics drivers are released frequently, and gamers should stay on top of those updates. PC audio tends to move slowly, but it's still worth checking to see if your sound card maker offers a newer drivers than what's on the included CD. If you're using the motherboard's integrated audio, download the appropriate drivers from the board maker's website. Once all the drivers are updated, launch the Windows Device Manager. The quickest way to do this in Windows 8 is using the hot corner in the lower left corner of the desktop. If all the drivers are installed correctly, the Device Manager window should look a little like this one. Yellow triangular icons with exclamation mark will be visible next to any devices that require attention. Finally, fire up Windows Update and download the latest patches for the operating system. Windows will want to install updates during your PC's next scheduled maintenance period, but since this is a new build, it's best to apply them right away. Then, here you go! Congratulations on building yourself a new PC from scratch. Now go enjoy the thing in place in games or something. Thanks again to Asus and Corsair for helping make this guide possible. You can read our thoughts on the best components for different budgets in the latest year's STEM guide at techreport.com. If you have questions or encounter any problems with your build, the folks in this Builders Anonymous section of our forums are happy to help. Or to keep up with new TR videos, subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook.